Friday afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to another video, and happy July 4th weekend. You can tell by the shirt, but this is gonna be one of my new favorite videos to film per month. This is going to be the movies I watched in June. This is going to be a long video, so grab some popcorn, grab some snacks, and get comfortable and hang with your boy Mike for almost 30 minutes. I swear, I have 26 films to talk about in this video. So without further ado, some of these are movies I have on Blu-ray and DVD. Quite a bit are from streaming, and I have 4 new theatrical releases. So let's get started. And the first movie I watched this month was Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom, and this is the 5th movie in the Jurassic franchise, and this came out in 2018, and you bring back Chris Pratt and Bryce Dallas Howard, and they go back to Isla Sorna, or is it Isla Nublar? One of those. And they try to get out all of the dinosaurs before a volcano erupts. Of course that happens, but most of the dinosaurs were saved, but now they're going to be auctioned off by the world leaders to prepare for military enhancements. You also have the introduction of the Indoraptor in here, and this was a decent film, but it's definitely not one of my favorites. You can check out my you can check out my review on this and my ranking on where it is. So yeah, this was a solid film, but it was just okay. And that was Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom. Moving on. The next movie I watched was Tucker and Dale versus Evil, and this was on Tubi. And I gotta say that this movie like deconstructs the whole slasher craze, because you just have like these 2 hillbillies that look not friendly and like murderous, but they're actually like 2 best friends, like going to like their summer vacation home, and all these teenagers like wreak havoc, and they are the evil in this movie. This is a very solid horror comedy. I mean, it's not the best movie in the world, but I had a lot of fun with it. And that was Tucker and Dale versus Evil. The next movie I watched was a very, very good movie, and my first movie on Netflix this month. That was Hell or High Water. And this is about like 2 brothers who rob banks to make ends meet. But it stars Chris Pine and Ben Foster. Ben Foster was like the crazy one, where he had like all these plots, but he ultimately dies in the end by Jeff Bridges, which is the ranger after both of them. It was a very, very solid crime thriller. Really enjoyed it. But that was Hell or High Water. The next movie I watched was Ready or Not, and another good horror comedy And this is about like a woman being married into like this family who just plays games, and it ends up being like a ritual. So she fights to survive, and she plays hide and seek. And of course, the family needs to kill her before sun up, and they ultimately blow up bombastically and very bloody, like. But I actually reviewed this movie a couple of years ago. It was one of the first reviews I did on my channel. So if you want my full review thoughts, check out that video. But that was Ready or Not. The next movie I watched was a rewatch of The Dirt. This was on Netflix, and it's all about like the rise and fall of Motley Crue. I watched this movie when it first came out a couple of years ago. Highly enjoyed it, and it's nothing like any biographical movie I've watched, because it is raunchy. It has quite a bit of nudity, and it was just a very wild movie. But the second time, I definitely appreciated it more, and I had a really good time with it. I mean, everybody who played in the band did a really good job. So that was The Dirt on Netflix. The next movie I watched was Jurassic World Dominion, and this was the epic conclusion to the Jurassic franchise. I posted my review thoughts on it a couple weeks ago, and it's also in my ranking, but this movie was just okay to me, because it took like aspects of Mission Impossible and Taken and added like kind of like an environmental crisis with it. And I have to say that it was just passable. I mean, none of these Jurassic movies aren't bad, but this one is definitely the weakest one. I mean, the best part about this movie was the inclusion of the big three, of course, with Sam Neill, Jeff Goldblum, and Laura Dern. They were the best part, but they were overshadowed by the Jurassic World cast, because it is their movie. And the big three were just there to bring nostalgia back. But like I said, you can check out my video on my full thoughts. Moving on to Beavers. And this was another horror comedy I watched on Tubi. The premise is absurd, but it's a really fun movie. It's basically about like these three girls who like go to like a summer rental home, but then chemicals start to spill on this beaver dam, and and the beavers become zombies. Beavers. But yeah, this is basically like a slasher comedy meets a zombie breakout. It was a very strange movie, but it was passable for what it was. And yeah, that was Zombievers. The next movie I watched was a much better movie, and my third movie on Netflix this month, and that was Hustle. And this was the new Adam Sandler movie, and it was his definite fanboy movie, because his favorite sport is basketball, and he's actually like this scout that goes to Spain, I believe, to find like this next prodigy. And it was a very, very decent movie. Probably one of his best that I've seen the past few years. I mean, he's been up and down in film quality in these past like 10 years or so, but I really enjoyed this one, and that was Hustle, starring Adam Sandler. Moving on to Final Destination 5, and I do have a confession to make. You will see all 5 of these in this video. I just literally binged all of these on a whim. I've seen these like so many times, and I just felt that it was a fun time to revisit it. But anyway, this was the 5th movie, of course, in the series, and the most recent one as of 2011. And it's about like this group of people who go to like a retreat for work, but then a bridge collapses and everybody dies. But I'm gonna be very repetitive when I talk about these movies. They cheated death, but then death came back for them one by one. So this is a very solid movie. It's actually one of my favorites in the series. And I gotta say, like, the cast in here is probably one of my favorite ensembles, as opposed to some movies coming up. But yeah, this is a very solid flick. Had some pretty creative deaths. Like, my favorite one was the second one, or the second person, where I like went to like this massage parlor wanting to get off, if you will. And it starts off like an acupuncture session, but then he slips, and then Buddha just crushes his head. One of the most satisfying deaths in this series. And then it's got a major twist at the end that makes total sense. You actually have the 2 survivors end up on Flight 180, which was the plane that blew up in the first one. When I first saw this, I was shocked. And it all came together very nicely. That's why this movie is definitely one of my favorites in this series. But that was Final Destination 5. Oh, and I watched all 5 of these on HBO Max, so I just didn't feel like adding a poster, so I just pulled them up physically. Moving on to Fear Street Part 2, 1978. And this was the second part in the Fear Street trilogy. Well, it's called Part 2, but this takes place in the events of 1978 at Camp Nightwing, and it's about it's basically like a Friday the 13th kind of short, if you will, where you have the sack head killer, and he just goes insane and starts wreaking havoc at Camp Nightwing. He actually is under the influence of Sarah Fear, which is like the witch who put a curse on Shadyside. Again, I watched all 3 of these movies last year, but I did a rewatch this year just because I wanted to. But continuing on to Fear Street Part 3, 1666. And this goes back to the origins of Sarah Fear and her story. So she is basically like this innocent teenage girl who didn't have anything to do with witchcraft, but she was accused of it. And ultimately, she sacrificed herself in the end, and her curse envelops Shadyside. And plus, you get the last 30 minutes or so to be Fear Street 1994 Part 2. One of my favorite climaxes in any recent horror movie I've seen in a while, but I highly enjoyed these two, and you'll see my thoughts coming up later in this video on Part 1. So, continuing on, my next movie was Frailty. And this is on HBO Max. And I know about this movie because it's Cody Leach's, well, it's one of Cody Leach's favorite horror movies, but it's more of like a religious horror movie about this man who claims to like see demons, so he has to hunt down people who look like demons. He's basically like a demon slayer, and he has his two sons help him out. This movie was a really fantastic movie and very underrated. And I don't hear a lot of people talking about it, but thank you, Cody Leach, for mentioning it. And I just put it on one night, and I definitely loved it. But that was Frailty, starring Bill Paxton and Matthew McConaughey. Moving on to Final Destination 2. This one had one of my favorite opening premonitions. This one had like the major highway pileup, and this one was bigger, bloodier, and just an all-around good time compared to like the original. My favorite death in here, man, you can say like the first death with the fire escape through the eye. That was pretty metal. Huh, pun intended. The second death with the glass plate falling on the kid. And of course, the barbed wire going through Jonathan Cherry, and he gets trisected. Very solid film, and I definitely like the bringing back of Ali Larter as Clear Rivers, but she makes a stupid decision at the end, and she ultimately gets her comeuppance. I mean, she like literally gets blown away. She almost made it. But when it comes to 3, and I will get into that when I talk about it, everybody pretty much dies in this series. Because it had the clue that Alex Browning did die off screen, but it was kind of a lame death. I mean, he just got whacked by like a falling brick, and that's all we know. But otherwise, this was a very solid sequel, and yeah, that was Final Destination 2. Moving on to another Netflix original movie, and this was Things Heard and Seen. And this was basically kind of like a ghost story, but it wasn't a ghost story. You'll see what I mean in a minute. But this is about like a couple who like move into like this new house, and Amanda Seyfried is feeling very uncomfortable with like her husband. He's like very unfaithful to her, and she figures out that he might be cheating on her, so she kind of catches him in the act. But he turns out to be like sadistic and abusive to her, and she ultimately dies in the end. Like, the husband kind of like snapped and axed her off, and he basically like lied about everything that he wanted to be. Like, he was like this art major who wanted to go to a college to teach art, but it wasn't his art. It was his dead brother's art that he passed off by. But this was a very solid ghost story that deconstructs it in a way. And the lady who helps out Amanda Seyfried was actually murdered by her husband, so they both haunt the house now. But very solid film. I highly recommend it. Moving on to, yes, Beavis and Butthead Do the Universe. And yes, this is a real movie. And this was on Paramount Plus. I watched it the first day it came on, and I fell in love with it immediately. And this takes place in 1998, and Beavis and Butthead like wreak havoc at their science fair, and they are assigned to like a space camp, but then they got sexually deviant with like a probe, and then they are accepted into the space program. And then they go through like a black hole to 2022. That's this entire movie, and I loved every single minute of it. My favorite section of this movie was when they were in college and they went around saying that they had white privilege. Some of the funniest stuff that I've seen from Beavis and Butthead after all these years. A very solid sequel. And this one might be one of my favorite movies of the month. But I watched this movie twice. And I loved it just as much as I did the second time. But that was Beavis and Butthead Do the Universe. Next up, I have the original Final Destination. And this movie came out in 2000. Stars Devon Sawa, Ali Larter, Kerr Smith, and Sean William Scott of all people. And this had the premonition of a plane exploding. Of course, all the survivors get off and die one by one. My favorite death in here was probably Val Lewton's death, which was the teacher. It was a very meticulous, thought out death, but it's very intricately plotted, because it starts off where a computer part just like gets into her neck and she starts bleeding all over the place, and then she starts to bleed out very slowly. She slips on the floor, and then she tries to like grab a rag on like a knife holder. Then the knives come down and stab her, and then the house blows up. So pretty brutal death, and definitely one of the best of the series. And I've always loved this movie growing up. It was one of my favorite movies probably when I was 10 or so. I watched these movies like so many times, and this one still stands out to be the best of the series. That was Final Destination. I am nowhere near done this list. I am still going. My next movie was Revenge. And this was on Shudder. Probably one of the first original Shudder movies I ever watched. And this was a solid revenge thriller that I thought was almost all in French. But you had like this American girl being hunted by her boyfriend and his two best friends. And of course it's a cat and mouse game on the girl being hunted. Well, she's the one hunting them for assaulting her. So she ultimately gets her revenge. And I really did enjoy this film. So if you haven't seen it yet, check out Shudder. It's on there. Highly recommend it. Moving on to Final Destination 3. And I have to say, this one has my favorite opening premonition. This was the roller coaster calamity, and favorite death in here. I'm not being misogynistic, but the first tanning bed death. And no, it's not because of the two hot chicks. But yeah, I've always enjoyed that death, those deaths, because of the creativity they used. I mean, whoever thought that a tanning bed would actually like fry you to a cinder? And the other death I definitely really like, that was over the top, was the weight falling down on the football player. That was brutal. But this one has my favorite cast, and this might be one of my favorites of the series. But that was Final Destination 3. Continuing on, we have Elvis. So, finally, after a few weeks, I did go to the theater 3 times this week. So, you'll see like the other 2 coming up in a minute. But this was Baz Luhrmann's new biopic about Elvis, of course. And this movie started off to be like very all over the place and frenetic in its editing. And it was very colorful, but there was a lot going on in the first 20 minutes. It was very hard to keep up with. And it helps that this movie is nearly 2.5 hours. Well, it is over 2.5 hours. But I thought that this movie like explored the mystery that is Elvis, but it's told in the point of view of Colonel Tom Parker, played by Tom Hanks, which one of the weirdest accents I've heard from Tom Hanks ever, because it's a very strange way he does it. But I do believe that that was the way that the Colonel talked. Austin Butler bought it, and I think he should be up for an Oscar nomination, but some of this movie is a little much. But when it goes into like the tragedy of Elvis, it really got redeemed. And this might be one of my favorite movies of the month. So that was Elvis. And I guess to clear this up, I said I was going to do a single or an individual review for Elvis, The Black Phone, and Lightyear, but I decided to just put it in this video. But moving on, my next movie was The Final Destination. And I do have to say that this one was the most cartoonish one. I mean, this one had like the racetrack accident, and my favorite death in here was probably Hunt, which was like the popular douchebag that was good looking. I mean, he got like sucked into like a pool drain after having sexy time with this hot chick at a pool. And it was definitely one of the most satisfying deaths I've seen in here. This isn't a really good movie. But this was the least I felt for the cast. This cast is probably like one of the worst. But this is more of like a guilty pleasure for me. And you'll see my thoughts when I rank my Final Destination movies. That might be my next video coming up very soon. And that is my secret video. But that was The Final Destination in 3D. But moving on. And I have 6 more films to talk about. The next movie I watched was Metal Lords. And this is on Netflix. And it was released earlier this year. I've been wanting to watch it for a while. And I had a really good time with it, because it had aspects of School of Rock. But it was just about like these 2 kids forming like a post-death metal doom band. And their title is pretty NSFW, but they change it to Skullflower at the end. And I really did enjoy this movie because it had a really good chemistry towards the 2 kids. And it was ultimately like an underdog story. But that was Metal Lords. Continuing on with Lightyear. Yes, I finally did see this movie on Tuesday. And I have to say, I've heard like mediocre reviews about it. I actually really enjoyed it for what it was. It was a pretty good sci-fi Pixar flick with Buzz Lightyear in the leading role. And he wants to like partake in this exercise that goes around the sun. He goes to like hyperspeed, but the faster he goes, the more forward in time he goes. So you have like a 62-year time lapse throughout this entire movie. And he teams up with this ragtag team of Star Command pilots. I really did enjoy this movie for what it was. And ultimately, it was a pretty good spinoff. So I'm pretty sure that we're probably going to get a Woody sex joke. I really hope they like rename that movie. But I'm pretty sure that we'll get like a Woody spinoff pretty soon. But that was Lightyear. Moving on to Fear Street Part 1, 1994. And there was a major gap in between. And this was my favorite in the whole trilogy. And this continues. Well, I guess you can say that this is the concluding chapter in a way. But it starts off Fear Street. Because it takes place in the 90s. And you have like an excellent soundtrack. Which, of course, a lot of songs I grew up on. And this was the closest to 90s slashers that you can go. One of the best gruesome deaths I've seen in any horror movie is in this film. And it is the bread slicer death. I had my jaw open on the floor when I saw that. I was like, but definitely my favorite of the trilogy. That was Fear Street, 1994. And moving on to Law Abiding Citizen. And I watched this on HBO Max. Been a while since I watched it, but this is about like a man who got attacked by like these two guys, and the two guys murdered his family in front of him, but he turns out to be like a psychopath. So he's on the hunt towards this counselor who is played by Jamie Foxx, and Gerard Butler is the crazy dude. He just has like this cat and mouse game of trying to kill everybody in sight. There are some very brutal, almost Green Inferno like torture scenes in here. Especially the dude in the beginning where he just like literally cuts him limb from limb. They don't show it, but it is very brutal. And I did enjoy this movie very well. And I have two more films on this list. Let's get them going. And these were the two films that I saw yesterday. The first film, The Black Phone. And this was one of my most anticipated horror movies ever since it got announced last year. And we finally got it. This stars Ethan Hawke as like this child kidnapper. He goes by the Grabber, and he gets the main boy and he keeps him in his basement to toy with him. But then there is a black phone hanging on the wall, and this phone has the communication of his past victims, and these past victims try to help him escape. Very solid movie. And I do have to admit that this one might be my favorite of the month. So, I definitely recommend this one. And it was based off of Joe Hill's short story in 20th Century Ghosts, which I haven't read yet, but pretty soon I will, hopefully. And yeah, that was The Black Phone. And it was almost my last movie of this month, but I watched my last movie of the month last night on HBO Max, and that was Still Waiting. And this was the sequel to Waiting back in 2005. And this sequel like covered like the most blatant ripoff of Hooters I have ever seen in movie history. And the main restaurant was called Shenanigans, but the wing joint next door, excuse me for the language, but it was called Tata's Wing Joint. And yeah, it was just basically like an employment romp, if you will. And it was nothing to write home about. I thought it was just okay. And definitely not one of my favorites of the month. And that wraps up my video on the 26 movies I watched in June. I hope you all enjoyed it. And my next video, after I get back from Branson over the weekend, will be my Final Destination ranking. So, look forward to that video. And then I will have a Thor Love and Thunder video. Well, review. And then might have a Where the Crawdads Sing review. And a Nope review. Plus many more videos coming in July. And this is almost a 42-minute video, so I'm just going to go ahead and wrap it up. And I will see you guys in the next video. Have a great 4th of July weekend. And stay cool. And don't do crazy stuff with fireworks. I'll see you guys in the next video. Adios. Peace.